In a wire-fenced holding pen outside Briars, France, on the morning of October 19, 1944, a German company commander sat on an overturned ammunition crate and watched American military police walk past him with clipboards. He had been captured the previous night, dragged from a collapsed machine gun position on the eastern slope above the town, and he had not slept. When an interrogating officer finally sat across from him and asked, through an interpreter, what had broken his line, the German did not answer with tactics. He answered with a sentence that the interpreter wrote down almost exactly as spoken, because it did not sound like the words of a beaten man, it sounded like the words of a frightened one. He said the small soldiers had come up the hill like men already dead, and that dead men, he said, cannot be stopped by fear. This is not the version of that battle you have been given in the documentaries with the swelling strings and the American flags rippling in slow motion. This is the version written by the men who lost, in the language they used when there was no reason left to lie to their superiors, to history, or to themselves. The German officer was no green conscript rattled by his first taste of combat. He had fought 2 years on the Eastern Front outside Kharkov and Kursk, had been wounded once by shrapnel near the Dnieper, and had been transferred west in the summer of 1944 specifically because his superiors considered him a steady hand under pressure, the kind of officer you send to hold ground, not the kind who panics at ghosts. Whatever he saw on that slope above Briars, he had already survived worse. That is what makes his testimony worth hearing. He was not a man inclined to conjure enemies out of imagination. He had catalogued real ones for years. To understand what unraveled him, you have to go back 2 years earlier and 5,000 miles away, to a training camp in Wisconsin where a battalion of American soldiers was being built out of men the government had months before called too dangerous to trust with a rifle. Sergeant Instructor Walter Kuroda, no relation to the Kuroda family whose name would later appear on a Medal of Honor citation, kept a small green notebook through his year training recruits at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, and later at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. In it, dated April 1943, he wrote a single line that the men in his platoon would repeat to each other for the rest of their lives, half as a joke and half as a prayer. We are training twice as hard because we will only be forgiven once. The 100th Infantry Battalion had been activated in June 1942, built from the Hawaii National Guard, men who had spent the winter after Pearl Harbor watching their neighbors get pulled into internment camps while they themselves were reclassified as enemy aliens by an army that could not decide whether to trust them with a truck, let alone a weapon. The unit's motto was Remember Pearl Harbor. Then, in February 1943, the War Department authorized a second, larger formation, a full regimental combat team, this one drawing not just from Hawaii but from the internment camps on the mainland, where recruiters walked between barracks asking American citizens imprisoned by their own government to volunteer to die for it. President Roosevelt announced the unit's creation with a line that would be carved decades later into a granite memorial, that Americanism was a matter of the mind and heart, not of race or ancestry. More than 12,000 men volunteered for roughly 3,000 slots. They trained at Camp Shelby for a year, bayonet drills in the Mississippi heat, forced marches through pine scrub, an unspoken understanding running through every company that their record in combat would be read, fairly or not, as a verdict on every Japanese-American family still living behind barbed wire back home. Their battle cry became a piece of Hawaiian pidgin gambling slang, go for broke, meaning to put everything on the line for one shot at winning big. They did not know yet how literally they would live that motto. The 100th Battalion went to war first, landing at Salerno on September 22, 1943, and driving into the brutal stalemate of the Italian campaign. In one engagement, they pushed German forces back 15 miles in 24 hours and captured the town of Benevento. Then came Monte Cassino, one of the costliest Allied battles of the European War. The 100th arrived in Italy with 1,300 men. By March of 1944, 521 remained. Other units in the theater began calling them the Purple Heart Battalion, a nickname earned, not given. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team arrived to reinforce them that spring, and in June 1944, at a cluster of stone farmhouses called Belvedere in Tuscany, the merged unit fought its first major action together. The Germans holding the high ground did not know that the depleted, overlooked 100th was quietly flanking their exit while other companies pinned them in place. In a few hours, the Nisei destroyed a German battalion and took the town, losing 11 men. It was at some point around this campaign, accounts differ slightly on exactly when the phrase first appeared in German field reports, that enemy units began referring to the Americans they now knew by sight, before they knew their strength on paper, as the Kleine Eisern Männer, the Little Iron Men. A German staff officer reviewing after-action reports from the Italian front that Sommer wrote something in the margin of one document that survives in translation, that the small soldiers fought as though already resigned to dying, and that this resignation made them nearly impossible to demoralize by conventional means. You cannot threaten a man with the thing he has already accepted. He coined a term for it in his notes, half clinical and half superstitious. Totsmut death courage, a battlefield psychology his own doctrine had no real answer for. It is the kind of phrase that tells you more about the writer's fear than about the men he was describing. By September 1944, the 442nd had been pulled from Italy and thrown into the invasion of southern France, attached to the 36th Texas Infantry Division under Major General John E. Dahlquist. They arrived in France on October 8, 1944, still dressed in summer uniforms as the Vosges Mountains settled into a bone-chilling autumn rain. Ahead of them lay a stretch of terrain that had not been breached by an invading army since the days of Rome. On the morning of October 15th, before the assault on the transportation hub of Briars began, a private named George Joe Saccato tried to break the tension rippling through his platoon. He jumped up, threw a mock Nazi salute, and shouted that he was practicing in case they lost. Nobody laughed. Hours later, they were crawling through mud under German artillery, and Saccato, a grocery clerk from Colton, California, 23 years old, rejected once already by an army that didn't want his face in its ranks, was doing exactly what every other frightened young man on that hillside was doing. He fired his rifle, by his own later account, terrified and praying at the same time, wishing he could fold himself down into the shell of his own helmet. It took 3 days of crawling, digging, and advancing barely 2 miles before the 442nd broke into Briars on the rain-soaked morning of October 18th. The Germans defending the town were dug in with mortars, machine gun nests, and Panther tanks, and every yard the Nisei took, they took by hand. 5 days later, on October 23rd, after house-to-house fighting in the neighboring hamlet of Bifontaine, a village their own officers had initially judged not worth the cost, the 100th Battalion took that too, though it cost them many of their most experienced men. They were told finally that they would rest, hot food, dry socks, a shower. On October 24th, they were pulled off the line. The rest lasted less than a day. 4 miles beyond the front, against the warnings of his own subordinate officers, Dahlquist had ordered the 141st Infantry Regiment's 1st Battalion, Texas National Guardsmen, roughly 275 of them, to push forward and occupy high ground outside Bifontaine. The Germans let them pass, then closed behind them, sealing off retreat, and threw 6,000 fresh troops into the encirclement with orders to hold at any cost. For 2 days, the trapped Texans were pounded by artillery, running low on food, water, and ammunition, while 2 rescue attempts by their own regiment failed to reach them. So the Nisei, still filthy from Bifontaine, still short men from Briars, were called back to the line. Private Ruddy Takua, 19 years old, from Salinas, California, went in with what was left of his company, a little over 300 men. It took 6 days to reach the trapped battalion. When his own company's sister unit, K Company, finally broke through, only 17 of the men who had started the push were still standing. Decades later, when asked about the mission, Takua didn't talk about heroism. He said he had always felt sorry that it was his own undersized outfit, a fraction the size of the division they belonged to, that was sent to make the rescue. The fighting was so close in places that American artillery and German artillery were landing in the same 40 yards of forest. George Saccato, still pushing forward days after his mock salute, later remembered the sound discipline it took to survive it. You jumped into whatever hole was open, whether it was already occupied or not, just to keep from getting hit. On the 3rd day of the push, elements of the 100th and 3rd Battalions, stalled below a steep ridge and taking fire from 3 directions, broke into what survivors would later describe only as a full sprint straight up the slope. No cover, no hesitation, bayonets and grenades against dug-in machine guns. Soldiers who were there struggled for the rest of their lives to explain it in ordinary language. The hill was afterward known simply as Banzai Hill, and 2 men earned the Medal of Honor there that single afternoon. It broke the German position. It did not end the battle, but it broke something in it. By the afternoon of October 30th, the lines had finally opened enough for the rescue to complete itself. A soldier named Mut Sakumoto was the first Nisei to reach the surviving Texans, and when he did not salute or shout. He held out a cigarette. One of the rescued men, a Texan named Ed Guy, remembered the moment for the rest of his life with the plain, almost embarrassed honesty of a man who has stopped trying to make his own survival sound cinematic. He thought he might have hugged the man who found him, though he couldn't say for certain. He was simply that glad to be out. 211 men of the lost battalion walked out alive. The 442nd suffered more than 800 casualties rescuing them, nearly 3 of their own for every 1 Texan saved. Company I went in with 185 men, 8 came out unhurt. Company K went in with 186, 169 were wounded or killed. There is a story, still disputed in its exact wording, about a parade Dahlquist called weeks later to honor the regiment, in which he was said to be visibly frustrated that so few men had assembled for the ceremony. When he turned to his executive officer and demanded that all the men be brought out, the answer came back steady and without apology: they already had. That was all the men left. In the days after the Vosges collapsed, German intelligence officers on that sector of the front tried, in their own clinical way, to explain what they had witnessed to superiors who found it hard to believe. One surviving fragment of analysis, passed hand to hand among captured documents translated by Allied intelligence after the war, attempted to describe why an undersized, under-resourced regiment kept absorbing the worst assignments, and kept somehow completing them. The document's author, whoever he was, reached for the same phrase the frontline troops had already coined on their own. He called it a Todesverachtung, a contempt for death, and speculated, with the strange mixture of respect and unease common to men trying to rationalize their own defeat, that soldiers denied full citizenship by their own government might fight harder than any other kind, because for them the war was not only against Germany. It was evidence they were building for a case they intended to win at home. He was not wrong. He was simply describing, in the vocabulary of an enemy staff officer, something the men themselves already understood as plainly as their own names. The regiment's war did not end in the Vosges. In the spring of 1945, at the request of General Mark Clark, the 442nd returned to Italy to help break the Gothic Line, a German defensive position that had held the Allies in place for 6 months. On April 5, near the village of Tindola, a 22-year-old private named Sato Munamori, a gardener's son from Los Angeles who had grown up picking produce in his family's stand, crawled alone toward 2 machine gun nests, pinning down his squad and knocked out both with grenades. Pulling back to an artillery crater where 2 of his men were sheltering, a German grenade landed among them. Munamori threw himself onto it, absorbing the blast, and died instantly. Both men beside him survived. He would become the only member of the 442nd awarded the Medal of Honor during the war itself. The rest, more than 20 of them, would not be upgraded from lesser decorations until 2000, a correction that came 55 years too late for most of the men it honored. In that same campaign, a young officer named Daniel Inaue led his platoon against a ridge of German machine gun positions above San Terenzo, was hit repeatedly, and kept moving forward until a German soldier's rifle grenade shattered his right arm at close range. He lost the arm. He did not lose command of his men that day, and he did not, in the years that followed, lose whatever it was that had put him on that ridge in the first place, a fact history would eventually record in the United States Senate rather than on a battlefield. We return now to the German company commander in the holding pen outside Briars, the officer whose testimony opened this account. Accounts of what became of him afterward are fragmentary, as they are for most captured junior officers whose names appear once in an interrogation log and never again in the official record. He was processed through a prisoner of war camp in the American zone, released sometime after the German surrender, and by most reconstructions returned to a small town in Bavaria to a trade he had left behind in 1939. What survives, passed down in family recollection more than an archive, is that in the 1970s, an elderly man told a local newspaper reporter doing a retrospective piece on the war that he still thought, from time to time, about a hillside in the Vosges and the soldiers who had come up it as if they had already decided long before they reached him, that dying was simply the price of being believed. He said he had spent 2 years on the Eastern Front learning what fear looked like in the men across from him. He said he had never, before or after, seen soldiers who looked instead like men settling a debt. They were smaller than the men who trained beside them, smaller than the men who doubted them, smaller even than the men whose enemy propaganda tried to laugh them off before it started fearing them instead. They were the little iron men, a name given by the men trying to kill them, worn afterward like a medal, because there was no better way to describe what they had become. They fought a war on 2 fronts, and only one of those fronts had a uniform on the other side. The little iron men did not ask to be believed. They went for broke instead and let the record argue for them, company by company, casualty list by casualty list, hill by hill, until belief simply became the only honest response left. That is the debt this account tries imperfectly to repay. Not admiration, which is easy and costs nothing, but memory, which is harder, and which is the only currency men like these ever actually asked to be paid in. The little iron men went up the hill. Some of them came down. All of them, in the way that matters most, are still standing there.